will say that I have shed innocent blood. What's blood for, if not for shedding?
With the upcoming possibility that Jordan Peele may be directing a remake of Candyman, it may be important to look at the original release alongside his commercial and critical hit, Get Out. This video essay aims to focus on race and representation, and how it may have possibly evolved or developed from the often underappreciated Candyman to the contemporary Get Out. The role of the victim, poverty and gentrification, prejudice, and the representation of the oppressed will be discussed so as to try and examine how two movies in the same genre can express these issues with similar or opposing artistic and narrative styles. This video essay will hopefully help to distinguish how certain groups are marginalized and how they can be represented and illustrated in the horror genre. This video essay may also serve as a general view and recommendation simultaneously as adding something valuable to the discourse of race and representation. Before discussing the popular commercial hit Get Out, it is important to examine Bernard Rose's perhaps undervalued gem, Candyman. Candyman is a 1992 horror movie directed by Bernard Rose which chronicles Helen, played by Virginia Madsen, who researches superstitions in a housing project within impoverished inner city Chicago. Before this gothic horror piece began production, the director, Bernard Rose, came under fire from many of his peers and producers for making the choice to feature a black horror villain as well as showing a community gripped by poverty, perhaps a representation that was all too real for some. In order to satiate these complaints, Rose himself met with the NAACP to discuss if his representation will come across disingenuous or perhaps even harmful. During these discussions, Rose asked simply, why not? Why can't a horror movie villain be black? After some small doubts and worries, Rose was given the go-ahead to direct this horror piece. Bernard Rose's approach to horror is distinctly different to that of many of his peers, as well as Jordan Peele's Get Out. What we are represented with is a gothic horror that provides commentary on race relations and inner city poverty. There are distinct contrasts between our protagonist Helen and Get Out's Chris. Whilst Chris is an outsider both in race and position to this privileged white middle class family, Helen is the white outsider coming into this place of horror and oppression, acting as a voyeur of sort, although Helen is fully aware of her position and impact. Helen is conscious that her research and published article may come across as an expose piece or even as exploitation. She certainly does not want to come across as a sort of white saviour and is instead a sympathetic catalyst for these stories to be heard by the community at large. Helen is unfortunately and unwillingly an addition to the process of gentrification and urban restoration after coming to the conclusion that her own apartment is victim to this very practice.
Once it was finished, the city soon realized that there was no barrier between here and the Gold Coast.
Unlike over there where you got the highway and the L train to keep the ghetto cut off.
Exactly, so they made some minor alterations. They covered the cinder block in plaster, and they sold the lot off as condos.
How much did you pay for this place?
Don't ask.
This again further separates Helen from the residents of Calibi Green, adding further barriers and tension between her and her subjects, although not intentionally. A more updated and perhaps often subtle commentary on race relations and class can be seen in Jordan Peele's 2017 Get Out. Although the racial prejudices might not be as visually obvious as in Candyman, this 2017 hit does offer many nuanced approaches to the subject matter. Get Out shows the plight of Chris, a gifted black photographer who must now undertake the daunting task of meeting his girlfriend Rose's white middle-class family. After some awkward pandering by the parents to deal with the interracial relationship, Chris begins to discover a horrifying truth about his future in-laws. What Jordan Peele offers the audience is a subversion of a situation in which many people in relationships dread, meeting the parental figures. This already tense environment is enhanced by racial undertones, with microaggressions and racial pandering abound.
So how long has this been going on, this thing? How long?
4 months.
4 months. By the way, I would have voted for Obama for a third term if I could. Best president in my lifetime, hands down.
I agree.
Yeah.
These comments, although at first may seem that they are trying to pass off that they are open to this interracial relationship and are progressive, are revealed to be attempts to put Chris at ease and be more susceptible to various methods of seduction, in particular hypnosis. Chris's darkest fears come to fruition by the final act. The racial undertones become explicitly real and tangible, turning this already anxiety-driven scenario into an ethnologically fueled nightmare. In order to further understand the racial and representation issues that both of these movies discuss, it is important to examine the role of the victim played by two major characters in both movies, our protagonists of Chris in Get Out and Candyman himself. First, Candyman will be investigated to show how Bernard Rose represents and illustrates such a character. Firstly, Candyman himself is a stark departure from the typical portrayals of horror movie antagonists. He is intelligent, articulate, romantic, as well as being acutely aware of the impact he has on his victims and the environment he prowls at large. Although he does spread terror and bloodshed throughout the feature, he is ultimately a pitiful and sympathetic character. He does not operate just out of vengeful lust or is inherently evil, but is instead searching for love, a catalyst that spawned his supernatural existence in the first place. The cause of his death being committing adultery with the daughter who was paid to paint a portrait of by a wealthy landowner, and as a result was dismembered and murdered by a white community. As such, Candyman is a creation and byproduct of hatred and racial prejudice and was punished for his so-called crimes. In this feature, the hatred and fear experienced by the predominantly white community is a real antagonist, with Candyman being an unfortunate victim, not unlike Chris being selected for his gifts and racial standing. Candyman was punished for having an affair with a white woman, which bears some similarities with how Chris and many of the servants of the Armitage family have been seduced and manipulated by Rose in Get Out. Candyman crosses the boundary of being a simple ghost story into the very tangible and real by seducing and controlling his victims under a form of hypnosis, also like how Chris is manipulated in Get Out. Candyman debases his victims, almost persuading them to want to become victims, influencing them into an emotional and vulnerable state, comparable to how Rose's mother begins to control Chris during her hypnosis of him.
You are not content with the stories, so I was obliged to come. Be my victim. Be my victim.
Now, sink into the floor.
Wait.
Sink.
Chris is hypnotized by Rose's mother by breaking down his emotional barriers and pushing him into a vulnerable state where he is susceptible to such attempts of control. There is an evolution of the victim throughout both narratives, although Candyman is now arguably the villain due to his murderous acts. As Candyman's profession in his past life was painting, as a punishment for his death, his right hand was sawed off and now in his boogeyman-like state is replaced with a hook, almost like a perverse extension of himself, now shedding blood instead of applying paint. In this state, Candyman is no longer a victim and is acting out his own agency, a similar transformation for the character of Chris. Early in the narrative, Chris and Rose accidentally hit a deer with their car. Upon viewing the dying animal by the side of the road, this has a profound and emotional effect on Chris, symbolising his lost mother who might have died in a similar fashion. This is played upon by Rose's mother during her hypnosis of him.
What about your mother?
What about her? Wait, are we?
Where were you when she died?
I don't want to think about that.
Upon being subjected to abuse and violent acts, Chris eventually breaks free from the control and restraints. It is also important to note that the weapon that Chris uses to dispatch the patriarchal head of the family, not a knife or a blunt weapon, but a deer head. The sharp antlers, not too unlike the hook that Candyman uses to dispatch his own victims. This symbolises Chris' transformation from being merely a victim to acting out his own agency and being in full control. Chris has come to terms with his emotional trauma and is now ready to take on any danger that faces him. In conclusion, it is clear to see that although both films perhaps share the same genre, they offer unique perspective and voices on these particular issues. Although Candyman was quite nuanced for its time, ultimately, Get Out is more effective and impactful in what it discusses and how it presents these issues. Some may disregard Candyman and its apparent slasher movie aesthetic, whilst preferring Get Out's somewhat subtle commentary on institutionalized racism and lingering prejudices. However, Candyman should not be ignored or undervalued, as it contains a layered subtext and a villain which is genuinely rare to find in not just horror but other film genres at large. With this in mind, it seems that Candyman would be a perfect narrative for a director such as Jordan Peele to take full advantage of, as well as adding considerable value to the discourse, narratively, visually and socially.